The moment assumptions met reality is something that can change the course of any interaction, and in his case, it began the instant he stepped into the room. From the outside, nothing about him screamed authority or leadership. He didn't enter with a posse of assistants or a flashy car waiting to whisk him away. There were no titles plastered on a nameplate to announce his importance. Instead, he moved with a quiet confidence, a subtle energy that most people would only notice if they really looked. But in that room, most people didn't look. They assumed. They assumed because of the color of his skin, because of their past experiences, and because society had long taught them to categorize before understanding. It was a routine kind of dismissal, so ordinary that most of them didn't even realize they were doing it. They saw him as just another black man. A phrase heavy with stereotypes and prejudice. A phrase that carries with it centuries of misjudgment. They didn't look at the way he carried himself, the way his eyes scanned the room with quiet intelligence, or the way his hands moved when he spoke. They only saw what they had been conditioned to see. As he walked past them toward the conference table, the assumptions were palpable. You could feel them in the half-smiles, the nods that didn't quite reach the eyes, the subtle shifting in seats as people adjusted their posture to accommodate someone they already thought they understood. People often underestimate how much their unconscious biases shape their interactions, and in that moment, the room was a living, breathing example of it. He noticed, of course, but not with anger or frustration. He had learned long ago that the first reaction is almost always misjudgment. What mattered was what came next, how people would respond when reality cut through their assumptions. He greeted the room with the professionalism expected of someone in his position, speaking with a calm authority that immediately set him apart from the casual expectations others had of him. His voice was measured, precise, and resonated in a way that demanded attention. Not because it was loud or overbearing, but because it carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. They listened, at first politely, nodding along without really thinking, still caught in the trap of their assumptions. And yet, there was something different in the way he presented himself. It wasn't ostentation. It wasn't showmanship. It was clarity, vision, and an unshakable sense of self that refused to bend to the preconceptions swirling around him. As the meeting progressed, subtle cues began to shift the room. A question he asked prompted deeper thinking. A point he made challenged the status quo, and the energy in the room began to change imperceptibly. People who had assumed they knew who he was and what he was capable of were now confronted with evidence that their assumptions were flawed. The realization began in small doses, a raised eyebrow, a pause before speaking, a glance exchanged with a colleague. These were the first signs that the room was starting to wake up to reality. Assumptions, after all, are fragile. They crumble the moment they meet undeniable truth. And in his case, the truth was clear, compelling, and impossible to ignore. The contrast between what people expected and what they experienced created a tension in the air, a subtle discomfort that was palpable. It was not hostility but surprise, a realization that their mental shortcuts had led them astray. They had seen him through a lens of bias, filtered by societal stereotypes and personal prejudices, and now that lens was breaking. It was in the way people straightened their posture, the way attention sharpened, and the way quiet conversations paused mid-sentence. Every moment he spoke chipped away at the assumptions, dismantling the invisible barriers that had been erected even before he had said a word. What made this moment even more striking was that it wasn't performed for effect. He didn't need to announce his position or flaunt his accomplishments. The moment itself was a revelation precisely because it was grounded in authenticity. The room was confronted with the reality of his presence, the reality of his intellect, and the reality of his authority. And in that confrontation, assumptions fell away, piece by piece, replaced with the undeniable truth of who he was. The energy shifted from passive disregard to active recognition, from casual dismissal to genuine attention. It was a transformation that happened not in an instant but in a series of subtle, accumulating realizations, and it was as powerful as it was inevitable. How appearances led to underestimation is something that happens every day, in every corner of society, often without people realizing it. In his case, the initial underestimation was immediate and instinctive. People looked at him and made snap judgments, shaped by decades of societal conditioning, by what they had seen in movies, in news, in passing interactions. They saw the color of his skin before they saw his suit, the perceived background before they noticed the confidence in his posture, and in that instant they mentally placed him in a category that carried little authority, little weight. It was an assumption so automatic that most in the room didn't even recognize it as such. The irony of human perception is that the more confident a person looks in their bias, the less likely they are to question it. And in that room, the assumption was so deeply ingrained that it seemed invisible, almost natural, as though it were the air they were all breathing. They expected someone different, someone whose appearance, demeanor, and tone matched the image they had in mind for a leader of a company. They expected to see a certain polish, a certain style, a certain familiarity with the trappings of authority that fit their stereotype of what leadership looked like. And when he didn't match that image, they dismissed him, often unconsciously. His appearance did not conform to the narrow template they had constructed, and because of that, their minds underestimated him before he even had a chance to speak. They didn't consider that appearances are misleading, that confidence and competence are not always visible at first glance, and that true leadership often resides beneath the surface, in qualities that are invisible until they are revealed through action. Underestimation can be both subtle and devastating, shaping the interactions, decisions, and respect people receive. In the meeting, it manifested in small ways: half-listening, interrupted thoughts, casual dismissals of his suggestions, a tendency to redirect questions to others who looked more authoritative to their eyes. Each of these small gestures reinforced a sense of hierarchy that existed only in their minds. The room was filled with invisible barriers, mental walls constructed not from evidence or experience, but from long-held prejudices and assumptions. He noticed, of course, but he had long since developed a patience for these things. He knew that appearances could be deceiving, that the first impression often tells more about the observer than the observed, and that real perception takes time, observation, and undeniable proof. The underestimation became almost tangible when he began speaking, presenting insights that were both precise and strategic. As he laid out his points, people were caught off guard. What they assumed would be a routine discussion led by someone else now had a depth and clarity that demanded attention. The mismatch between expectation and reality created a tension that was hard to ignore. They had anticipated something ordinary, and yet what they experienced was extraordinary. Each carefully chosen word, each confident observation, chipped away at the invisible wall of bias, forcing a reassessment of what they thought they knew. It's fascinating how the human mind reacts when confronted with evidence that contradicts its assumptions. Shock, surprise, disbelief, all can emerge in rapid succession, often expressed through subtle shifts in body language. Leaning forward, pausing before responding, furrowed brows, quick glances exchanged between colleagues. All of these are signs of a mental adjustment taking place, a recalibration of perception in response to undeniable proof. And in that room, this recalibration was happening in real time, as his competence and authority began to override the automatic judgments that had shaped their initial interactions. The danger of underestimation lies not only in how it affects those being underestimated, but also in what it does to those who underestimate. It creates blind spots, miscalculations, and missed opportunities. The people in the room had assumed that they knew his capabilities, yet they were confronted with the uncomfortable reality that their assumption was flawed. It was a lesson in humility, not through lecture or confrontation, but through demonstration. The power of appearances is deceptive. It can lull people into misjudgment, but reality has a way of asserting itself, often in ways that leave a lasting impression. Every suggestion he made, every strategic point he highlighted, reinforced the truth that leadership is defined by action and insight, not by the preconceived notions others carry. His appearance might have led to underestimation, but his performance demanded recognition. And as the meeting progressed, the underestimation that had dominated the room at the start began to dissolve, replaced by a growing awareness that the person in front of them was far more capable, far more commanding, and far more influential than anyone had assumed. The revelation of his true role came slowly, almost like the turning of a key in a lock, unlocking the reality that had been hidden behind layers of assumptions. Up until that point, most people in the room had seen him only through the lens of their own biases. They had categorized him, labeled him, and unconsciously decided what he could and could not do. And then, as he spoke with clarity, authority, and insight, those preconceptions began to crumble. There is a unique power in revelation, in the moment when someone's true position and influence is revealed, because it forces the observer to confront the gap between expectation and reality. In that boardroom, the difference was stark. They had assumed he was an ordinary attendee, maybe a consultant, maybe someone less influential than themselves, and now the truth hit them with undeniable force. He wasn't just a participant. He was the person steering the entire company. The subtle cues had been there all along, if anyone had bothered to notice. The way he carried himself, the quiet confidence in his tone, the way he asked questions that revealed a deep understanding of the business. These were all signs of someone in command, yet no one had connected the dots. Humans often underestimate the subtleties that signal true authority, focusing instead on overt displays, titles, or appearances. And because he did not feel the need to assert his position through performative gestures or loud proclamations, it allowed assumptions to flourish unchecked. It wasn't arrogance. It was authenticity. And it made the eventual revelation even more powerful, because it was grounded in reality rather than theatrics. When the realization finally dawned, it swept through the room like a wave, subtle at first but then growing in force. Eyes widened, some faces froze mid-expression, and the casual confidence that had dominated the room earlier began to shift. There was a mix of surprise, disbelief, and a dawning respect that replaced the earlier underestimation. People began to adjust, subtly repositioning themselves, leaning in, focusing more intently, as if physically acknowledging that the person in front of them commanded their attention. It's fascinating how humans react to revelation. Our minds struggle to reconcile what we assumed with what is real, and in that struggle we often reveal our own prejudices and limitations. This revelation also carried with it an unspoken lesson. Leadership is rarely about being seen, it's about being effective. While appearances can mislead, action and insight cannot. In that room, the evidence was irrefutable. The ideas he presented, the depth of understanding he demonstrated, and the confidence with which he communicated were all indicators of someone who was not just a participant in the company, but the one guiding it. The truth, once revealed, demanded acknowledgement, and acknowledgement changed the energy of the room. Conversations became more attentive, questions more focused, and every word he spoke carried additional weight. The revelation transformed the dynamic entirely, shifting the balance from casual disregard to genuine engagement. There is a certain beauty in witnessing a revelation like this because it exposes the fragility of assumptions. People believe they know someone based on surface-level observations, but reality often has a way of quietly appending those beliefs. In his case, the revelation was not just about his identity as the leader of the company. It was about the broader lesson that assumptions are dangerous and can blind us to truth. Each person in that room was confronted with the gap between their perception and reality, and the experience became a mirror, reflecting their own biases back at them. The revelation was both personal and collective, impacting not just the perception of him, but the understanding of themselves and the environment they operated in. It's also important to note that revelations are most effective when they are earned through competence rather than claimed through ego. He did not announce himself with grandiosity. He revealed himself through clarity of thought, strategic insight, and the undeniable presence of authority that comes from doing the work, understanding the organization, and being the one responsible for its direction. This kind of revelation resonates far deeper than any title on a nameplate or any outward display of power, because it is grounded in substance rather than appearance. The room, once filled with casual assumptions, was now attentive and engaged, forced to recognize the truth of his role and the implications it had for every interaction, decision, and relationship moving forward. The reactions of those who doubted him were immediate, layered, and deeply revealing, exposing both the subtle and overt ways bias shapes perception. From the moment he stepped into the room, there had been skepticism, an almost imperceptible questioning of his authority, and the faint undercurrent of disbelief that often accompanies assumptions rooted in prejudice. People doubted not because of his competence or demeanor, which were impeccable, but because of a mental framework that had been established long before they had ever met him. Doubt is often a mirror of the doubter rather than the person doubted, and in that room, each reaction reflected internalized notions of hierarchy, identity, and expectation. The initial glances of disbelief, the subtle hesitations in responses, and the quick, silent assessments being made all spoke volumes about the assumptions they had carried in unknowingly rigid patterns. As the meeting progressed and his authority became apparent, the shift in their reactions was almost theatrical in its subtlety. Some straightened in their seats, adjusting posture as though to recalibrate their mental map of the situation. Others paused mid-sentence, realizing that their previous intention to assert dominance or dismissive commentary no longer applied. It is a fascinating phenomenon, how doubt is transformed into reconsideration when reality begins to contradict expectation. Human psychology is wired to cling to assumptions, yet undeniable evidence forces a recalibration. And in that room, the recalibration was both rapid and profound. The doubters were confronted with the tangible proof of his leadership, and their internal dialogue shifted from skepticism to a mixture of surprise, humility, and respect. The reactions were not uniform, as doubt manifests in many forms. Some displayed polite curiosity, leaning forward with an intensity that had been absent earlier, listening more attentively, asking sharper questions, and seeking to understand rather than to preemptively judge. Others experienced discomfort, a subtle internal resistance to the truth that challenged their long-held assumptions. This discomfort often shows up externally as micro-expressions: a raised eyebrow, a slightly pursed lip, or a delayed nod. These small, almost involuntary cues reveal the inner struggle as their minds work to integrate conflicting information. The doubters had to reconcile their preconceptions with the reality before them, and this process, though silent, was deeply significant because it represents the moment when judgment yields to recognition. What made the reactions even more compelling was how quickly the energy in the room shifted once doubt was met with undeniable competence. Initial hesitation gave way to active engagement. Questions that had been shallow or rhetorical became meaningful inquiries. Suggestions that might have been ignored were now considered seriously. The room, which had initially been colored by bias and assumption, began to fill with a sense of recalibrated respect, even if unspoken. There is a unique intensity in moments like this because it exposes the contrast between expectation and reality in real time. People are forced to confront their own limitations, their own prejudices, and the subtle ways they misjudge others based on superficial markers rather than substantive evidence. The emotional undercurrent of these reactions is also noteworthy. Surprise, often coupled with admiration, can transform into a quiet acknowledgement of authority. In some cases, doubt can give way to inspiration, as individuals witness firsthand the disconnect between appearance and capability. The doubters were learning a lesson not through instruction but through experience, through witnessing someone embody a level of competence, clarity, and leadership that far exceeded their initial assumptions. And in that learning, the room shifted, the dynamics changed, and the previously unchallenged hierarchy of perception began to crumble, replaced by a more accurate understanding of who he truly was. Another aspect of these reactions is the social ripple effect. When one person acknowledges the reality of his role, others often follow, either through subtle imitation or through conscious reconsideration. Doubt is contagious, but so is recognition. As each doubter adjusted, the room collectively moved closer to truth. Conversations realigned, interactions became more measured, and the overall energy became one of attentiveness rather than casual disregard. It was a transformation that demonstrated the power of evidence over assumption, of authenticity over appearance, and of leadership over expectation. The reactions of the doubters were no longer barriers but indicators of the magnitude of impact, reflecting not just individual realization but a collective shift in awareness. Lessons on bias and perception are often learned in ways that are subtle, yet unforgettable, and in his case, the lesson unfolded in real time before an audience that had assumed they already knew everything about him. Bias is a powerful lens through which people view the world, shaping expectations, influencing decisions, and creating invisible barriers that can limit opportunities and distort reality. From the very start, the assumptions made about him were not based on what he said, what he did, or the depth of his experience, but solely on preconceived notions about his identity, his appearance, and the